So there was a landmark study conducted about 25 years ago that showed that women who with MS who get pregnant have a significant decreased risk of relapse during pregnancy, but only to rebound during the early postpartum period before returning to pre-pregnancy rates later in the postpartum year. This fear of having a postpartum relapse has become the cornerstone of our counseling recommendations over the last 20 years. It drives both women's desire to start a family and their choices to whether or not and choices of whether to breastfeed or go back on DMT. Because we didn't have a whole lot of data, there was a lot of uncertainty about what they should do. And one of the things that we were worried about is that a lot of physicians were telling women that they either shouldn't get pregnant because they might have this bad relapse in the postpartum period, or telling them that they need to go right back on their treatment and forgo breastfeeding for their infant completely. Some of the women had told me stories about how they actually were told not even to leave the hospital before they got their first shot to restart their medicine. And we were doing all of this without any data. In the meantime, the public health field was gathering tons and tons of data that breastfeeding was really good for the infant and also for long-term maternal health benefits, particularly prolonged and exclusive breastfeeding. So the reason we did the study was really to try and understand what are the modifiable risk factors for this increased risk of postpartum relapses. We were particularly interested in the trade-off between breastfeeding, particularly breastfeeding exclusively, and resuming their disease-modifying therapies. So what we did is we went through the medical records of Kaiser Permanente, Northern California and Southern California. For those of you who are not familiar with what our organization is like, it's got about 9 million covered lives. That's the size of like a small European country, and they get all their care through us. So we have all of their obstetric and neurological history and any other visits to any other physicians, as long as all their laboratory data and their imaging data available to us in the mother's record. And in the infant record, as part of the baby-friendly hospital push, our pediatricians and the nurses in their clinic have been collecting very detailed information at every well baby and immunization visit on breastfeeding and formula feeding. So the surprise finding of our study was that not only are the women much less sick now with MS than they were 20 years ago, and by that what I mean is that they're having far fewer relapses both before, during, and after pregnancy, but there also is no longer an increased risk of relapse in the postpartum period. So what we saw is, just like in the landmark study from 25 years ago, their risk of relapse declines during pregnancy, but rather than rebounding in the early postpartum period, it just slowly goes back up to the pre-pregnancy rates about, around 3 to 6 months postpartum. So that's really good news for women with MS today. It means that they really don't need to fear this risk of relapse in the postpartum period. 78% of the women had no relapses during the entire postpartum year, even though 58% of them didn't ever resume therapies in that postpartum year.